Hello, and welcome to The Artist's Eye, CMA's Modern Masterpieces. This is a talk that was originally presented on July 29th online, and it's part of an ongoing museum series called Wednesday at 2. And I'm David Stark, I'm Chief Curator of the Columbus Museum of Art. And the topic of this talk has to do with an installation in the what we call the historic building of the museum, the section of the Columbus Museum that opened in 1931. And we have in one particular gallery, and this just opened a few weeks ago, a presentation of works in the permanent collection from the early modern period, that is, from the turn of the century, from the Impressionist period up until the early decades of the 20th century. And the installation is called The Artist's Eye because the way that the works are organized has to do with different themes and ways in which artists will depict similar kinds of subject matter, similar kinds of subjects in very different ways, which I will explain in just a few moments. The reason that we have all of these great masterpieces in the permanent collection, many of which you'll be familiar with. It's like looking at old friends, but in a different context, in a different location, is because so much of the historic building, or the Ross Wing, as we call it, is occupied by special exhibitions that also draw from the permanent collection, but are taking the space of areas in which these works would normally or have in the past been exhibited. So, for example, there's an exhibition of folk art called Folk Art Road Trip. There is an exhibition called Early Elegance of 18th and 19th century quilts, both of which are wonderful shows. And it allows us the opportunity to focus on these both European and American masterpieces that give a good survey of modern art on two continents in the from the late 19th to early 20th centuries. And in the middle of the gallery is this freestanding wall with the title of the exhibition, The Artist's Eye, next to one of the paintings that is related to one of the four themes. Each of the four walls carries a different theme. So one wall is about cities and towns. And the example that I'm showing from that particular wall or theme is a work by the American artist George Bellows, The Snow Dumpers from 1911, that shows in New York the activity of dumping snow taken from streets and sidewalks of New York into the Hudson River, the process of clearing snow in the wintertime. It's depicted in a straightforward manner. Next to Nature has to do with images of landscapes or objects in nature. And again, French artist Camille Corot, in this view of Saint-Lô, which is a town you see in the background. There is a view of nature, a landscape. Most of the canvas is occupied by the cloudy sky and trees and grass, with this silhouette of the town in the background. The third topic on yet another wall, The Solitary Self, has to do with portraits. Most of the portraits are of individuals. In a few instances, like this work by the German artist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, there are two figures, but the term or the title, The Solitary Self, still applies because these are two figures that really aren't communicating or connecting, and there's a sense of isolation. And the last theme, wartime, has to do not so much with scenes of combat as views of the home front or reactions to war, particularly World War I and II. And this image by Robert Delaunay, 20th century French painter, of a Portuguese woman who is a servant, who is tending to flowers, has to do with the artist's move during World War I to Portugal in order to avoid military service. So it looks like a very pleasant view, and indeed Portugal was a sunny, colorful environment far removed from the wartime tragedy that was ravaging France, Germany, and other countries in Europe. But it is exhibited beside other images that are more straightforwardly connected to the world wars. And the different approaches, again, coming back to the title of the installation, The Artist's Eye, can be grouped in the following ways. There is a realistic mode of presentation that I would say is well represented by the Bellows painting Snow Dumpers and the Corot landscape, a straightforward depiction of objective reality. The expressionistic mode, I would say, is well represented by Ernst Kirchner. This self-portrait with Erna is expressive through means, well, that you can define expressionism as the distortion of shape, space, and color in order to intensify the mood of the work. And in this case, there's a sense of anxiety, psychological isolation that has to do with the way that space is compressed. The angular shapes of the objects and figures are exaggerated, and so there are uncomfortable looking jagged edges, and the colors tend to clash and be unpleasant, thus a communication through formal means of a mood of anxiety. The painting by Delaunay, The Portuguese Woman, it would be a good example of abstraction in which shapes and formal elements like line, pattern, color, or shapes are more dominant in the composition than the subject matter. So that the Portuguese woman that is more or less representational on the right-hand side of the painting is almost takes second place to these circular shapes that you see, especially in the center and lower portion of the painting. And the colors are less imitative of actual appearances than arrangement, a selection and arrangement of colors by the artist who chooses colors of the prism to create this very light-filled, colorful composition. The going to or launching into the subject of the first theme, the wall of the exhibition devoted to cities and towns. I take you back again to this introductory wall, which is opposite a wall consisting of 4 paintings, all of urban centers or small towns or villages. This painting by Edgar Degas is a painting by an impressionist artist, Degas the Impressionist, this movement that was based on depictions of the open air, outside atmosphere, or a lot of emphasis on sunlight and brushwork, which is spontaneous and detached. But this is an image of not the kind of theme that you see in the artist's work earlier on in his career in the 1870s. This is almost a 20th century work. It was done around 1898, and it represents a small village in which the artist, when he was a child, spent his summertime, his holidays. And the rendering of the village is not particularly straightforwardly objective. Impressionism is usually thought of as a very realistic movement in which the that which the artist saw or experienced is depicted in a very straightforward, spontaneous way with fidelity to the optical impression, the visual appearance of people, places, and things that the artist experienced, and depictions in that spontaneous way of modern life. And this, on the other hand, is more of a memory. And there's distortion here that I'll talk about in a minute, but wanted to indicate that, as I said earlier in the artist's career, he would show images of Paris more than small towns and villages, Paris in the present, the modern, up-to-date Paris, with people in fashionable clothing, in fashionable places in the city in which people, the upper middle class, would stroll. And both, oh, and I should also point out that the boldface captions in this presentation indicate that the work is in the installation itself. So the red outline, as opposed to the blue outline, encircles text in boldface, compared to the other painting by Degas, titled "The Place de la Concorde," which I will be indicating works that are in other museums, or that are maybe in the collection of the Columbus Museum of Art, in which case I'll designate CMA, but they're not in this particular installation. So that said, here's another example of an earlier work by Degas that shows Paris not the out of doors environment, but in interior space, in which, however, is flooded by sunlight. So natural light is very important to the Impressionists. But in this case of the houses at the foot of a cliff, as the painting is called, the artist distorts the architecture. He apparently based his composition on photographs, but yet he rearranged the architecture of the houses and the terrain. And what's most evident is that the color does not conform to actual appearances. The color of the sky, the lavenders, the blues, and the blue roofs of the houses, these are subjectively altered. And so this has to do with more of the interior or the inner life of the artist, his memories, nostalgia, creating a mood of melancholy, and recalling memories of childhood. So as opposed to the objective realism of his earlier Impressionist phase, this is much more of a subjective rendering. And some art historians connect this work to the expressionist movement that would emerge in the early 20th century. And they look at the late years of the art of Degas as very advanced, and he was an artist who was very much respected by the younger progressive avant-garde artists that were working in that belonged to movements and helped launch and initiate movements like Expressionism. So the wall that is facing this work that I just talked about, the Degas painting, contains 4 works showing cities and towns. The first 2 I'll enlarge are George Bellows' The Snow Dumpers that I already looked at. You can see in a little more detail all the activity that's going on in New York City, the horses, the carts, the officials that are engaged in dumping the snow. And this realistic approach to New York emphasizes the grit of the city, not trying to embellish, but presenting the hustle and bustle, the work of the working classes, the smoke coming from the the smokestack of the ship, the dirty snow in the foreground, the fact that it's not a sunny but a rather cloudy day. And rendered in an overall dark palette. It's similar to The Man and His Dog. Again, somebody from the not the upper echelon of New York society, but seeking out the poor, the working classes, and showing them with energetic brushwork in dark colors. This is the so-called ashcan school aesthetic that is the movement with which Bellows is associated. Bellows, the most prominent artist ever to emerge from Columbus, one could argue. He moved to New York after he grew up, went to school in Columbus, attended Ohio State, and almost graduated, but instead of finishing, he moved to New York in 1904. So Man and Dog, this is an example of a painting that is not in the installation, but is in the permanent collection of the Columbus Museum. And it, along with another 3 or 4 works by Bellows, is hanging in a corridor not far from the installation that is the focus of my talk. But the Snow Dumpers is exhibited next to a work that's quite different, done about 10 years later by the artist Charles Demuth. And it shows a smokestack and a grain, or a silo, I should say, a silo and a smokestack representation, you might say, of agriculture and industry in a style that is connected with the avant-garde movement of Cubism that emerged in France in the early 20th century. So Charles Demuth, he came from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He spent most of his career going back and forth between New York and the smaller city in Lancaster, and very much influenced by this avant-garde European Cubist movement that was all about emphasizing geometric shapes, flattening space, and presenting subject matter in the form of flat overlapping planes. And in addition to the rather simplified depiction of the architecture, you see diagonal lines in blue and white that are crossing the smokestack and the silo. And these are abstract lines very much inspired by the geometric planar breakup of objects of Cubism. Sometimes these lines are called ray lines, and they're almost like spotlights on the objects. And this title, Aucassin and Nicolette, I mentioned, influenced stylistically of the French movement of Cubism. Aucassin and Nicolette are from a French legend of star-crossed lovers. It is a very long story, somewhat similar to Romeo and Juliet or Tristan and Isolde. These two lovers are often separated and then reunited, and then tragically forced apart again. And this is a representation of the two lovers by a 19th century British artist, Marianne Stokes, just to give you a visual representation of what Demuth is alluding to metaphorically. And I'll show you another work in our permanent collection. We have a lot of important paintings by Charles Demuth that come to us from an early 20th century collector by the name of Ferdinand Howell, who left his collection to the museum in 1931 when our so-called historic building opened. And so this Incense of a New Church is similar to Aucassin and Nicolette in that it is a depiction of a modern industrial cityscape, but with a title that has to do with the European past. In this case, the smokestacks and the architecture of factories is compared to towers and medieval architecture of churches, and the industrial pollution coming out of the smokestacks is compared to the incense of a church. This style of Demuth and several other artists who painted in a way somewhat similar to him. This style is known as Precisionism, which is sometimes called American Cubism, and it's basically Cubism applied to American industrial subject matter that is not as abstract as European Cubism, does not fragment objects as much, but it does emphasize the clean, geometric, industrial shapes of the architecture that is depicted. And Precision primarily concentrated on architecture. You see very few figures or people in Precisionist paintings. And this is another, perhaps the most famous Precisionist work by Demuth, called My Egypt, another example of an imaginative title. These are grain elevators. The painting was based on a photograph, and look at those so-called ray lines as if they are spotlights highlighting this monumental presentation of grain elevators. The title My Egypt implies that these are perhaps the modern equivalent of pyramids. And there's a personal element here in the way that there's a kind of ambivalence between whether the artist is admiring these American industrial and agricultural buildings and vignettes with the spotlighting and the dramatic presentation of them, or whether he's mocking American, you could interpret this as American provincialism compared to the cultural heritage of Europe. In any case, it's a pretty subtle and witty way of presenting these subjects. And another facet of Demuth's art has to do with the fact that he was a gay American artist. And there are certain art historians who look at these kind of oblique and enigmatic and witty titles that are very ambivalent with the way in which gay Americans in the early 20th century lived a kind of a covert life. And there's and certainly Demuth would have experienced greater freedom in New York compared to the small town where his family lived in Lancaster. But even in New York, he certainly would have faced constraints and restrictions, prejudices, and so on. And I'd just like to read a passage in a recently published catalog of the American collection of the Columbus Museum of Art. The catalog is called Reflections. I'll say a few more words about it at the end of this talk. And the article about Demuth's painting was written by Adam Gopnik, the art critic of the New Yorker, and he talks about the point of view of the paintings by Demuth in the following way. The persecuted gay man seeks the refuge of implication and half-tone. Again and again, we see Demuth's work. When we see Demuth's work, we're struck by this note of evasion, of punning implication, of working by suggestion. Far from camp, it is a painterly tone where mockery balances on a knife edge with moonlight. And he compares this oblique approach of Demuth with more straightforward realism by artists who aren't gay, with the phrase, there's the aggression of plain statement. of the heterosexual male in those more straightforward representations compared to the approach of Demuth. And he wasn't particularly talking about Bellows, but I think that the juxtaposition of the realism of Bellows with the approach of Demuth makes for a very interesting comparison, and helps illuminate the particular approach of Demuth. And then the movement, yet another movement that is particularly American, called synchromism, but very much influenced by European movements, is represented by Stanton MacDonald Wright in California Landscape, on the far right of the wall, with the theme cities and towns. And this is a movement that is all about color, the prismatic color, colors of the rainbow into which white light is broken when it passes through a prism. And MacDonald Wright and Russell worked together in Paris in the years leading up to World War II and developed this notion of painting with color, almost constructing compositions of color like music. And the word or the term for their movement, synchromism, is based in the root words with and color. Sync, meaning with, and chrome, meaning color, similar to the word symphony, which is sim, with, phony, Phon, meaning sound. So rather than with sound, this is with music. I'm sorry, rather than with sound, this is with color, synchromism. And in the case of the work by Morgan Russell, you see that this is almost totally abstract. You don't see representations of recognizable objects or places, whereas the California Landscape is straightforwardly representation of a geographic location of a town in California. And this is where MacDonald Wright settled after moving from Paris. At the time of World War I, a number of American artists came back to the United States, including MacDonald Wright and Russell. And I would propose that this is a view of California, or of a California town by the seacoast, that is viewed not from high atop a mountain, but rather seen from an airplane. And this is, I think, borne out by the fact that MacDonald Wright was very interested in flight, air travel, hence the painting on the right, airplane synchrony in yellow-orange that's in the Met. And so you can see the clouds, such a very high vantage point. And I did talk a little bit about the work by Delaunay, The Portuguese Woman, in my introduction, and its relationship to the wartime theme. And Delaunay's movement was he called his experimentations with color Orphism. He developed his style in tandem with his wife, Sonia Delaunay, who was a textile designer. And Orphism is visually has a lot of similarities with synchromism, but without going into too much detail. It tended to, there was more emphasis placed on this motif of the circular colored disc and the relationship of these abstract arrangements of circular shapes and color with, in an almost supernatural way, connecting them with heavenly bodies, planets and stars in the sky, and what the artist referred to as cosmic vibrations, that he thought had parallels in the way that there was visual vibrations of the colors in his compositions. So there you have cities and towns running from views of cities in Europe to New York all the way to the West Coast. And the work by Jacob Lawrence, we have the Street Scene Restaurant, a view of New York, the neighborhood of Harlem, by a preeminent 20th century African-American painter whose career stretched all the way to the year 2000. He passed away, Jacob Lawrence did, and continued to paint up until his final days. These are, or this is a representation on the left of one of his early works, and we're fortunate to have a pendant painting. This is actually, there were 3 paintings in this series that represent the hard scrabble life early in the artist's career. These are scenes of prostitution, and the street scene on the left shows 3 working girls, 2 seated, 1 standing by a lamppost, and then a prospective client who's white and is in a very guarded way approaching the women with one hand in his pocket and another clutching his coat. The artist, Jacob Lawrence, moved from Philadelphia to Harlem as a teenager, well, as a child, and as a teenager he was fortunate enough to get art lessons through a Depression-era program, federal arts program that was part of the Works Progress Administration, WPA, a series of federally funded programs to help revive the economy that were instituted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the exposure that he had through art classes, through exhibitions, and then when he became a professional artist, some support that he got for his painting through the WPA funding is in was the source, the exposure, the training, and so on, the opportunities to be familiar with a wide range of art. And if you look at, for example, the style of street scene and interior scene, both, they show the flatness, the emphasis on geometric shapes, the outlining, the contours, the presentation of space that's related to Cubism. And in particular, I'm showing what's often considered to be the first more or less fully Cubist work by Picasso. The Young Ladies of Avignon is the translation of the title, and it shows a scene in a brothel. So in terms of its content, it's related to these works. And in particular, though, the mask-like faces are pretty similar. And the influence of African art was fundamentally critical to the development of Cubism. And if you look at the face of the gentleman on the left, you see certainly some resemblances to the conventions of masks, similar to the way in which they're depicted by Picasso, and then a very different kind of influence, but still operative and pointed out by art historians, is the resemblance to characteristics of 17th century Dutch scenes of everyday life, like this example in the lower right by De Hoek of a courtyard that has the emphasis on the rectangular structure of the buildings and architecture and the wall and the gate, similar to the door frame, the window frame, the rectangular bricks of the work by Lawrence. So these formal elements and connections with European styles are important and significant, and these works were completed just a few years before the most famous series by Lawrence, which would be the series of 60 paintings called The Migration of the Negro, this series that chronicled the Great Migration during the World War I era of African Americans from the Deep South, where they wanted to escape the segregation, the discrimination, the violence, in order to seek opportunity and employment in the northern states. And so this is just on the cusp of the creation of that very important series. Now, moving to the wall paintings called Next to Nature, I explained landscape views. The largest painting on that wall is, and the most prominent certainly, is by Claude Monet, called Weeping Willow. And this has relevance to World War I. I've mentioned the war several times already, and the very name of the tree, the weeping willow. For centuries, willow trees have been associated with sadness, mourning, funerals. And this is the environment in which the artist lived in later in his career, where he moved from Paris to far away in the countryside of Normandy. His country home of Giverny was the house was beautifully surrounded by flowers and lily ponds and trees like the weeping willows. And he paints this in a way that is different from his earlier impressionist work, just like I was pointing out the contrast between the earlier work of Degas and the later landscape or townscape in our collection. So here's an example that we do have in our permanent collection, the view of the Mediterranean that shows in earlier decades the way in which the artist emphasized the bright open air sunlight and movement, and this technique of divided brushwork and optical blending, everything in motion, the water, the sun reflecting on the rocks of the shore. And there certainly is movement implied in Weeping Willow, and also a spontaneity of brushwork, but it's a much heavier touch, and the colors are darker. And this is less about optical appearances than about establishing a mood of sadness and mourning. And the artist did face, besides the tragic loss that he was expressing about the scores of people that died, soldiers and civilians in the war, and there was an influenza, a Spanish flu influenza that was responsible for many deaths as well. But his son, Jean, his eldest son, died from an illness in 1914. He himself was experiencing or was diagnosed with cataract. So the realization that he was losing his eyesight, these things were weighing down upon him very heavily, and are expressed in a powerful way in this painting that could be connected with the expressionist mode of painting. And these different styles certainly overlap, so that a painting that is essentially realistic in terms of its foundation can also be expressive, or expressionistic paintings also have, they often, if perhaps most, more often than not, have elements of abstraction as well. So there's a lot of overlap. But at any rate, the work that is now in our museum was originally intended to go to the French government to be in a public building along with other related works. There's a large cycle of paintings of weeping willows, of flowers, lily, the ponds with the lily pads in the museum in Paris called the Orangerie, a cycle, a very powerful, dramatic cycle of paintings. But this, for some reason, was never turned over to the French state, and we're very fortunate to have it in our permanent collection. And then a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, and look at how small it is in the photograph of the installation in the upper right, small compared to Weeping Willows. And it shows leaves by this artist, Georgia O'Keeffe. She is from the Midwest, from Wisconsin. She had art training at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her early career unfolded in New York, and in her later years, she moved and stayed and resided in New Mexico. But these leaves are abstract in a way, but yet realistically depicted. You are sure that you're looking at leaves rather than abstract shapes and patterns. And her style is very different than the other paintings that we just looked at, in that she has very smooth surfaces with evenly blended brushstrokes and clear, sharp contours and details that are linear. um, she's best known in terms of her still lifes for flower paintings. And the Jack in the Pulpit on the right, for example, in the National Gallery in Washington, is a good example of flowers that are viewed from a very, very close perspective, so that they almost look abstract, and you might have a little more trouble uh, recognizing the subject matter, that these are flowers or what type of flowers they are, because of that close perspective and the way in which she creates these or places prominence on the geometric, not on the geometric, but on the abstract. They're very organic, on the abstract shapes and forms, more than merely imitating the natural appearances. And there's something to be said about the way in which these leaves are shown in different stages of color, or the way in which the brown leaf on the bottom, for example, is turning dry and brittle and about to crumble. And a connection with some of her still lifes in the New Mexico phase, where she paints skulls, or very often, as in the example on the right, in the Art Institute of Chicago, skulls and flowers. And these would connect the autumn leaves, which, by the way, were painted at Lake George in upstate New York. The theme of vanitas, vanity, the notion that perishable objects are metaphors for the brevity and transience of life, so that leaves, flowers that wilt, soap bubbles that pop. These go back to late Renaissance and 17th century still lifes that often show sands going through an hourglass, or watches, timepieces, butterflies. And so the notion of the fleeting nature of life, and the beauty that objects that are bound for destruction and decay is, I think, a theme that's embodied in this still life by O'Keeffe. And moving to the portrait wall, the first two portraits, left and right, are both women painted in an expressive style, women by the Russian artist who worked in Germany and is connected with the Impressionists, Alexei Yalinsky. The woman's name is Shoko. That was actually her nickname, that is related to the word for chocolate, because she loved chocolate, and she was a favorite model of German artists. And then Matisse, showing a model whose first name is Laurette, and who was painted very frequently during this World War I period by Matisse. And the expressive nature of Jawlensky's work is most evident in the green face of the model, the very rough brushwork and the fan and the background, the intensity of the colors, and the way that the complementary color of the red hat and the scarf clash with the green of the model's face. And there is a similar but more restrained intensity in the red jacket with the gold brocade of the model Laurette. This is probably a Turkish or Middle Eastern jacket that she is wearing, very richly patterned and beautifully colored. And the decorative elements that Matisse is so famous for, however, in this painting and in this phase of his career around World War I, are held in check a little bit. The background is a rather subdued shade of emerald green, and the curvilinearity of the costume with its decorative elements and the curly hair is restrained or held in check by the rectangular shape of the chair and the parallel stripes. And this is a toned down version of the earlier style of Matisse, who's known as a Fauvist. And the Fauvist movement was launched at about the same time in Paris as Expressionism was in Germany, 1905, 1906. Some call Fauvism the French version of German Expressionism. And this portrait of the artist's wife on the left, which is 11 years earlier than the work on the right, shows the more expressive and aggressive version, more extreme form of Fauvism. It's nicknamed, this painting of Madame Matisse, nicknamed the Green Stripe because of this bold green stripe in the center of the woman's face. The left side of her face is yellow. The colors of the background are arbitrary, and Fauvism was about arbitrary color that the artist selects in order to create a composition of interest that would create a compelling mood rather than using color to imitate what the artist saw in nature. And the word Fauvism is related to the word wild, to the word in French for wild beast, because a hostile critic thought that the Fauvist paintings were wild, or the artists were like wild beasts, or that the works of art were wild. And there's this restraint that you see in 1917. I keep coming back to World War I, that is attributed to the somber, more austere nature of life on the home front during the war. And the later teens were also a time in which Matisse's style was more influenced by the Cubist movement, which placed less influence on color, was not very decorative, and was in general aesthetically a more austere movement. Then the African American artist from Chicago, Archibald Motley, painted this beautiful portrait of a woman in front of a mirror, brown girl after the bath, in 1931. Um, Archibald Motley is connected with the Harlem Renaissance because although he lived out his life in Chicago, he actively exhibited and traveled to New York. And he also spent 6 months of the year 1929 through a fellowship in Paris. And so exposure to old master paintings like Venus, paintings of Venus at the mirror, this is just one example of what nudes in front of mirrors, the way that they were typically depicted in Renaissance and Baroque art. This clearly had an influence on Motley, but he shows a real woman rather than a supernatural goddess or an imaginary figure. And this was also a tradition. Here's a 17th century Dutch painting by Gabriel Metsu of an everyday woman who is clothed, obviously not nude, in front of a mirror. And it's as if the artist is modernizing a subject, bringing a mythological subject into the real world through the nudity, the mirror, but showing an everyday woman in a contemporary context and modernizing an old master theme. So, for example, the lamp and the fashionable shoes of the woman place her in a particular specific time and place. The model of this painting is not known, but it is a very distinctive and unusual. The subject of an African American nude woman is a rarity in amongst the works of Archibald Motley or the Harlem Renaissance in general. And Motley is very well known for his paintings of the everyday life of the African American community in primarily Chicago. So this work in the Art Institute of Chicago Nightlife is a great example that shows a more modernist side of the artist's style in terms of the exaggerated kind of electric color, the streamlining and treatment of form in a more modernist way, simplified, streamlined approach to depicting the figures with emphasis on rhythm and pattern that has been compared to a kind of visual equivalent of jazz music, which the people in the nightclub are listening to, that's playing on the jukebox that you see in the right-hand corner with that red head on top of the jukebox. So a very different kind of contrast in style here. And the individual figure by Paul Cézanne of Victor Choquet depicts a patron of the arts who was a great friend of the Impressionists, and well, Cézanne was a post-impressionist whose art embodies certain characteristics of Impressionism: broken brushwork, light or light-based color, not very much in the way of browns or blacks, but his approach to form was different. And it tended more towards abstraction. So Renoir gives you a good sense, the Impressionist Renoir, a good sense of the appearance of the collector, Choquet, and notice that he's got a painting in the background, just like the rectangular paintings in frames behind Cézanne's portrait of Choquet. And notice that the hands in both portraits are similar. He obviously tended to sit with his long fingers intertwined. And what's interesting about Cézanne's post-impressionist style is this emphasis on structure and geometric shapes. He famously said once, treat nature in terms of the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. And he also has this tension between the three-dimensionality that is depicted and the flatness of the picture surface. And if you look at the spots of red throughout the painting, on the carpet, on the wall behind the seated figure, on the upholstery of the armchair in which the figure is seated, and even the red lips, you get taken back to the two-dimensional flat surface of the painting, even as you simultaneously acknowledge that it's a three-dimensional subject that's being painted. And Cézanne is looked upon as a painter who is very influential to the development of Cubism, directly inspired Picasso, who saw an exhibition of his art in 1906, the year of Cézanne's death, and that powerfully affected the development of his Cubist style. So that by 1910, he was painting not Victor Choquet, but an art dealer, Ambroise Vollard, in a style that's more radically abstract, but it shows the elements introduced by Cézanne with the faceting of planes, and the emphasis on geometric shapes, and the use by Picasso of multiple vantage points, which you don't see too much in this portrait of Choquet, but in many still lifes and landscapes, this notion of multiple vantage points, looking at from different viewpoints in the same picture, the same image. That's something that's taken to a further extreme by the Cubists. And the wartime paintings, I will only look at, well, we've already talked about Delaunay, but looking at two artists. One would be Marsden Hartley, who was German-American. He lived in Berlin, visiting with he had relatives in Germany, and was present in Berlin during the years prior to and the outbreak of World War I. And he's well known for his so-called German medals series, in which military insignia, medals, flags, banners that are connected with the German military are depicted in cubist-like paintings, um, similar to cubist collages, as if there were bits of pasted paper in addition to painting. But these are all oil paintings, and references and allusions to the German military. On the left, there's even a soldier on horseback. This is much more imaginative or imaginary on the left with the clouds. There's a kind of religious symbol, the Ox of St. Luke, and the crosses, the iron crosses that are both Christian and military. And there's a particular poignance and sadness, not so much in these paintings that represent the enthusiasm and the naivete at the beginning of the conflict, when the Germans thought that the war wouldn't last very long and they'd be able to carry off an easy victory. But there was a tragedy that Hartley experienced in that soldier that he was very close to. And he was a gay American artist. It's not clear if the affection that he felt towards KVF in the lower right-hand corner of this portrait of a German officer that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art on the right, if Karl von Friedrich, the soldier who was killed, if there was any kind of relationship between the two men other than perhaps a secret crush that Hartley had. But this death of von Freiberg affected him very deeply, and the dark black color in the background that seeps into the objects in the collage-like treatment of flags and banners, and even the whites are muddied with that black background, makes it a very sad, elegiac, tragic painting. And to have two paintings from the German medal series in our collection makes us a very fortunate museum. And we have many paintings, about 6 or 7 really good paintings by Hartley. And the final image of wartime, having to do with an infamous wartime atrocity that preceded World War II, was part of the Spanish Civil War that was a prelude to the World War, when Francisco Franco, in his efforts to take over the government of Spain, carpet bombed a small town that apparently had resistors, had members of the resistance to his the regime that he was trying to impose. And so the tragic death and there's just the atrocity of bombs being dropped on civilians was something that the war that sparked world outrage. And it was most famously treated by the large painting that's now in the Queen Sofia Museum in Madrid by Pablo Picasso, that shows his Cubist style combined with the more current movement of surrealism. So there's nightmarish dream imagery and symbolism in this representation of the cruel violence that befell the town of Guernica and the Spanish people. And in the case of Rockwell Kent, the American painter, you see that the two females are far from the violence, but you see the planes, you see the smoke coming up from the town in the background. And whether these women are whether the girl and the older woman are related or not is unclear. Maybe grandmother, granddaughter, or two townspeople that happen to be random survivors and don't have any kinship. They are experiencing post-traumatic stress, especially the older woman. And then the original title of the painting was Shadows. Notice the shadows in the foreground. And these shadows may be friends, they may be enemies, and it adds to the tension of the painting. And interestingly, both works were sent on tour during or following the incident of Guernica. Well, Bombs Away was painted after the war. It had been going on for a couple of years. But the fees that were charged when the paintings traveled to different cities in America were used to support or to aid Spanish orphans and refugees and victims of the violence of Franco. The painting of Guernica means a lot to the Columbus Museum because I was talking about the tour of different American cities that went on during the war because Picasso did not want it to go to Spain. He painted it in Paris, but once it went to America in the late 30s or 40s, it never returned to Spain on Picasso's wish that it not come back to Spain until Francisco Franco died. So he died in 1975, a few years after Picasso's death, and the painting painting was returned to Spain in the early 1980s. So I'm just showing you a few press clippings from the exhibition of the work at the Columbus Museum in November of 1941. So let's see, 2021, that's going to be an anniversary year for the exhibition of Guernica in Columbus. And so for my closing images, this catalog that I talked about of the American collection of the Columbus Museum, it's called Reflections, and it is an amazing catalog with essays by a wide variety of writers. There are two different covers, but it's the same catalog. And if you can't find it in your library, it is available in the museum shop, or you can order it online through the museum website. And I invite you and encourage you to go to the next Wednesday at 2 program that will be on August 12th, the topic of which will be Amina Robertson and the Spirit of Home, the presentation via Zoom by Carol Genschaft and Dieter Hamler. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope that you'll return in August and into the fall for other presentations for Wednesdays at 2.